All right, people of the internet, welcome to Atheist Edge. Today I am joined by Dr. Ben Burgis. Dr. Burgis, how are you doing tonight?
I'm pretty decent. How are you?
I'm not doing too bad. Thanks for asking. Just to give a quick introduction, Dr. Burgis is a philosophy instructor, a columnist for Jacobin magazine, and a regular opinion writer for the Daily Beast. He has a Substack, which is linked in the description below, as well as his YouTube channel. And he also, I guess he writes mostly about politics on the Daily Beast and Jacobin, but on his Substack, he writes about philosophy mostly. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Burgis. I really do appreciate it. The reason why I wanted to talk to you is because I understand that you are a socialist, and I am very interested in the implications of socialism, especially in the current state of affairs that we have today. I guess really quickly, I'd ask, is there anything you want to say before we get started, or should I just go ahead and shoot my questions off?
No, let's just do it.
Okay, great. So I guess my first question is then, what is your general take on the current state of affairs in America today?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that, I think that we live in kind of an astoundingly unequal society. The richest man in the world was also the biggest donor in our last presidential election, and he got himself this strange appointment as the head of this government pseudo department that slashed and burned its way through the federal budget. And at points almost seemed like a co-president. I think that we have an economy where there are people who, if you work at Amazon, people skip bathroom breaks because they're electronically surveilled all the time to make sure they don't fall behind quota. But also people are really happy to have that job because it's better than the alternative. And also, their boss, Jeff Bezos, owns his own spaceship, right? So I think the general state of things is bad, even before you kind of start to get to, the way that our, legal system is getting.
Kitty alert.
Oh, hold on just a second. I think I could do. All right. Yeah, my cat walked over the keyboard and started playing something else in the background, but okay, it does. So yeah, look, I think the general state of things is pretty grim, even if you're just kind of talking about the sort of basic starting point before you even get into some of the things that have happened recently, as far as the political system becoming more authoritarian, the the sort of loss of due process rights. I think that nothing that's been happening lately particularly brings me joy as far as all that goes.
Absolutely. So socialism offers some solutions potentially to the current state of affairs. The more that I grow and learn and live it, seems to me that the way that the word socialism is used in the world today, in my culture at least, seems to be is like a slur almost. It seems like that is intentional. It's I can't help but feeling like I am been propagandized to think negatively about that word every time I hear it, and I'm wondering how intentional that is. And as I get older, it seems like it's pretty obvious how intentional that is.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously people who have the most under the system right now don't want to have to give any of it up. And, people who have a lot of power in the kind of economy that they, that we have right now don't want to have to share that power. So, there is a lot of pro status quo kind of anti-socialist propaganda just kind of ambiently. I mean, what I find interesting is not so much that, because it's like, that's kind of what you'd expect, right? I mean, like given given that nobody nobody wants to give up their wealth or power. I mean, that's just kind of a human given, right? In any society. So I think there's some pretty obvious incentives for it to be that way. And the media in a country like the United States is going to be mostly is going to be owned by people with enough money to own media companies and et cetera, right? So a lot of this is like not really rocket science. But
every single thing I've ever heard has been given to me by a rich guy.
Yeah, I mean, look, what one, so I think all that makes sense. What's interesting to me is kind of the other way around, right? In other words, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I can remember like in 2012, that if some conservative like Sarah Palin, called some Democrat a socialist, it was sort of taken as a smear and sort of responded to that way, right? Like you were saying, it's an insult. I mean, and that's kind of the default of American politics for as long as I can remember. What's interesting to me is actually the extent to which that started to change a little bit, right? That you have somebody like,
ask you about next.
Yeah, right. I mean, so I don't want to step on your question, but I mean, like,
no, please go ahead. I was going to ask you, like, do you think that the situation that we're dealing with now is turning people's minds in the other direction in relation to socialism?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, right? I mean, in 2016, Bernie Sanders was the senator from Vermont, but like if you didn't live in Vermont, you probably didn't know who that guy was. And calling himself a democratic socialist, he won like 22 caucuses and primaries in 2016. In some ways, got even closer in 2020, and you had these other people like AOC who were elected to Congress with the same kind of rhetoric. And it did seem, to be fair, it did seem for a long time like, okay, that was this little moment, right? This little insurgency from the left, but that was put down pretty effectively. That, after 2020, it seemed like, okay, the empire struck back, right? The Democratic establishment kind of quashed all that pretty effectively. And in a lot of ways, that's true. But then looking around right now, you have like Bernie and AOC are going around doing this anti-oligarchy tour where, you're getting these just insane crowds of a kind that, I mean, outside of Trump rallies, I guess on the other side, right? You just don't typically get in American politics. And, these people are actually quite popular, and just like the approval ratings as politicians. And look, it's way too early to see if this turns into anything or not. I mean, we'll just kind of have to see. But I think that there is maybe an opening here, which would make sense to me because it just seems like, look, we had 4 years of a really uninspiring centrist Democrat being president, and the kind of problems that led to Trump in the first place didn't go anywhere. And now Trump's president again. And I think that feeling, right? I mean, that like there's been a lot of discussion about that word oligarchy. I saw like Elisa Slotkin say, "Why are you talking about oligarchy? People don't even know what that means." Right. And it's like, I don't know. I think that like using the word that we've been using to describe bad rich people in Russia forever, and using it to describe, describe really rich people in America, I actually don't think that's beyond like what most Americans can understand. But it's like, I think maybe it resonates right now, right? Like just because of some of what's been going on and just the sort of general direness of the situation.
Do you think that people that subscribe to Ayn Rand's version of philosophy would be, I guess, unmoved by the idea of an oligarchy? They would be actually in favor of that or cheering for that?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that I think what they would tell you is that they don't really care how rich somebody is. They just, as long as they got it the right way, right? I think that would be their line, right? That right. In other words, if
that's how it works in real life.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like that's the thing. because like that's if you read Ayn Rand, like Atlas Shrugged, the idea, like the heroes of these books, John Galt or whoever the guy at the Fountainhead is, I don't remember. They have these are like these captains of industry who just sort of by their like entrepreneurial pluck, right? Became really rich, and so they deserve every penny of it. And I guess I think like, okay, I think that a lot of those people have oftentimes sort of look at really existing oligarchs kind of through that lens, that it's like, oh, see, Elon Musk must be this like John Galt kind of figure or whatever. And, one of a few problems with that is that, I mean, like you were kind of hinting, like in real life is very unlike an Ayn Rand novel, right? I mean, like,
right.
Like SpaceX and Tesla and all those things have like benefited massively from government contracts and et cetera. So it's not clear to me, like, even if you're sort of assuming an Ayn Rand kind of value system, which is obviously not at all my value system, but even if you are assuming that, it's like very unclear to me that these people should, pass the test.
So I guess I am trying to make a video that is for people who are, predisposed to be against socialism.
Sure.
I want to ask you to address some of the criticisms and concerns that they might have. I have a list here of certain things that they might say.
Sure.
The first one I have here is that they might say socialism always leads to economic failure. How would you respond to that question?
Yeah. Okay. And please cut me off if I'm taking too long, because it is kind of a big question, right? But like, I guess to me the follow up would be like, what do they mean by socialism, right? Like, in other words, traditionally going back to when the word is first coined in the 19th century, socialism meant the extension of democracy from politics to the economy. So workers, communities would collectively own, democratically run the factories and the farms and warehouses and all that kind of stuff. So like, when the Labour Party in the UK, started up, it was a socialist party. And so clause 4 of their constitution talked about, securing for workers the full fruits of their labor through the common ownership and popular administration of the means of production. And the reason I want to start with that question about definitions, which like I know that's always like a little bit of a like, okay, wait a second, why are we wandering off and doing definitions right now? But it's like the reason I want to start there is that I think when people say socialism has led to economic failure, what they're usually thinking of is the kind of system they had in countries like the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And if you understand socialism the way I just said it, then that's really not it, right? But that wouldn't count. But look, define terms however you want to define them, right? I mean, like, I actually think the least interesting argument we can have here is about semantics. If when you say socialism, you just mean state ownership of the means of production, whether it's democratic or not, then sure. The Soviet Union represented one kind of socialism, but it's certainly not the kind that I would advocate. It's like if I said, I want coffee, and you say, no, but coffee kills you. And I say, what? Coffee doesn't kill you. What are you talking about? And then you point to some example where someone was killed by drinking like arsenic that was filtered through coffee grounds. And I said, no, that doesn't count as coffee. When I say coffee, I mean like water, like hot water that's filtered through coffee grounds. And we have this big back and forth semantic argument about that. And you could accuse me of being, no true Scotsman because I'm saying that the arsenic, filtered through coffee grounds doesn't count as coffee. But really, I think the right resolution to that is just to say, okay, if you define coffee broadly enough that you count the arsenic version, then sure, that kind of coffee is going to kill you. But it doesn't follow that coffee in general is going to kill you. Certainly not the kind that I'm saying we should make, right? So my basic objection in capitalism is that it's an unequal system where democracy stops at the gates of the workplace. So people don't really get a say in how to divide up the fruits of what they're making with their work. And I want something where people who don't have money aren't ordered around all day at work by people who do have money, right? I mean, that's the sort of most ambitious thing that I would mean by socialism, is getting beyond that, having democracy at work, like Richard Wolff talks about. And so given that, right, I want something more democratic than what we have now, not less, right? So the kind of top-down Soviet way of organizing the economy, I mean, that's the arsenic coffee in that analogy. And I know this has already been a long answer, but I do want to just make one other point about this, which is uh, I think that part of what people are often thinking of when they say socialism leads to economic failure is something I haven't even really touched on yet. Because a lot of times people aren't even thinking of like a fully socialist economy. So like there's that Margaret Thatcher line where she says the problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money, right? Thatcher wasn't talking about like a fully socialist economy. She was just talking about like doing too much redistribution, too big a welfare state, too much of the stuff that like the Labor Party, which was pretty moderate by the time she came along, was like advocating. And at that point, I feel pretty comfortable calling bullshit on that because it seems to me that the countries that have made the most progress in that direction, your sort of Norways and Swedens and Denmarks and Finlands, right? These places that have kind of done the most in terms of, they're not like post-capitalist countries by any means, but they've done like tons and tons of redistribution, all that. These seem like some of the most successful societies ever built by human beings to me. These are places that always dominate the rankings of countries by happiest populations, even though it's winter like 11 months of the year. So, I feel like that should tell you something.
When people say they want a free market system, they talk about America being a free market system. Often they also will retreat back to saying that this is not actually a free market system, that we haven't actually achieved that because of the social programs that we may have. I'm wondering, do you think that we've ever seen? Yeah, have you ever seen? Have we ever seen a truly socialist country or a truly communist nation? Has that ever existed?
Sure. So again, in the sense that I'm talking about, that we have something that's more democratic than capitalism, right? We kind of extend democracy into the workplace, like that sort of most ambitious horizon of socialism. In that sense, no, we haven't. Right? I think that, I think we've seen, again, I think we can like kind of look at countries that are closer to that ideal or farther away, right? I think we can do those comparisons. We can say like, look, I mean, if you compare a country like the United States, where even the health insurance is private, where the laws make it really hard to organize a union, et cetera, to like countries in Europe where they even have even like Germany, right? They have for big companies, they're like co-determination laws where like at least some of, it's a minority, but like some of the seats on the board that runs the company, have to be like representatives of the workers and the unions. Like, I think that's closer, right? I think that what you have again in like the Nordic countries, I think is a little bit closer. So I'd say the same way that like, you were kind of talking about Ayn Rand followers earlier, the same way that like a pure libertarian, I think would be within their rights to say, yeah, nowhere that actually exists is like all the way to my utopia, right? And they'd be right when they said that. I'd say the same thing the other way around. I mean, it's just where I would like kind of stake my claim is if we're going to rank countries on like how close they are to one or the other, right? I think that every step we take towards a more egalitarian, democratic, socialist kind of utopia make society better. And I would argue that every step that we take toward that sort of libertarian utopia where everything's privatized makes things worse.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's kind of obvious at this point. But so I have another one of
Sure.
They might say that it destroys individual incentives. This one has always been interesting to me. What do you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't agree, obviously, but I mean, I think if we're kind of trying to like dig down and say, okay, is there like a core of this where they have like half a point, right? Where it's like you can see like it's not totally baseless. I think that core is really going to be about markets. And one point I'd make about this is that like markets and capitalism are not the same thing. You've had markets in some form, people buying and selling things for thousands and thousands of years. Capitalism in the sort of greater scheme of things has existed for about 5 minutes. Just kind of, really something that emerged in the last few hundred years where, to be really clear about what I'm talking about, like when I say capitalism, I mean a system where, the means of production, those factories, farms, warehouses, Walmarts, all that stuff, right? Where that's bought and sold by private capitalists, right? That kind of system, as opposed to like what you had before, feudalism, where, you had some people were lords and some people were serfs, or like what people like me, again, at the sort of most ambitious, like, getting all the way to that sort of democratic socialist utopia would hope for, which is that you have democracy at work, which doesn't necessarily mean that you've completely eliminated all markets. Because I think if we're going to be honest about this, the problem with the Soviet economy wasn't just that it was undemocratic, although obviously that's a huge problem, but also that they did have trouble coordinating production priorities with like consumer preferences, in the absence of what economists call price signals, that, you can sort of see how much people are willing to spend on something and adjust accordingly. And
They
so
also
that's
have
what you're
an environment
yeah.
that's very prone to famine, and they also had very bad science.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it wasn't. I was kind of a storm of a lot of problems, but like, yeah, this was definitely one of them. And I'd say, like, sure, if we're trying to figure out how could we do socialism now, I'm not necessarily saying forever. I mean, God knows, maybe in the future, development of AI, et cetera, we'll get to the point where we could just sort of have like algorithmically automated economic planning and it'll work out great, but that's speculating, right? So if we're just going to talk about, what we know how to do right now, I'd say that, look, it could be, we sort of know, we can look out at the world at these, Northern European social democracies. We can say, look, there's a lot of stuff that's in the public sector that's outside of the market completely in those countries, healthcare, education, et cetera. We kind of know that those things, at least, you can definitely take out of the market and still have really good results. In fact, much better results, I think, objectively. And it could be that there's some consumer goods, et cetera, that you do need those price signals for. We kind of don't know how to do it efficiently without some market incentives. But I'd say that doesn't mean that we need to have the, businesses in those sectors run by just whoever can afford to buy them. I think we could still have, if we do still need some market sector, I think it could at least be a market sector of worker cooperatives. And look, to like really drill into that point about individual incentives, if you look at like those worker cooperatives that exist right now, certainly, it's not like they have 100% even pay scales, that nobody's paid more or less than anybody else is, right? That it could be that even if workers themselves get to vote on what the pay scales are, it could be that you could still convince people that you need to offer higher salaries to incentivize people to do certain things, that some jobs that might involve a lot of stress and responsibility, or on the other end, some jobs that are particularly dirty and dangerous and nobody wants to do, which, by the way, under capitalism, we fill those jobs by having a pool of people who are desperate enough that they'll take whatever they're given, which I don't think is a great system. I think it would be much better if we had to incentivize people with more money to have to get them to take those jobs. But like, what you don't have in a worker co-op, or in like a sort of expansive public sector, or in any of these contexts, what you don't have is some people making hundreds of times more than other people. And you shouldn't. Right? Nobody is working hundreds of times harder than anybody else. I just fundamentally don't think that passes the laugh test.
The GS scale comes to mind as something like that, where it's, tiered. People make incrementally higher sums, but it's not some kind of exponent kind of thing. And it kind of seems counterfactually to me, like when they say that it destroys incentives, they're also saying that there is no incentive to do work just for the sake of work, or they're saying that you need the profit motive, you need the greed, right? Essentially, that's what they're saying. We need greed, that we are just greedy people. I mean, I'm not saying that they're wrong necessarily.
Sure.
We are there's a lot of greed in humanity, but I would say that if that's the crux of our system, our greed, maybe we should aspire to higher things.
Yeah, I mean, look, if the more I agree with you. I think we need to be realistic about the fact that there's like a fair amount in there, and you need to account for that. But like also, yeah, I mean, the more we have an economy that sort of has to rely on the worst things about us, right? Then all else being equal, the worse that is, right? I mean, and it's certainly, I don't know. I mean, I also just think a lot of this stuff, I feel like, I'm not even saying that we can have this sort of most expansive, most utopian setups that, there's all sorts of things you have to take into account, but like at least don't settle for this without a lot more experimentation with other ways of doing things.
Right, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to another one of those potential
Sure.
objections to socialism. How would you respond to the idea that socialism inevitably leads to authoritarianism, which we did kind of touch on
Yeah.
already a little bit?
Yeah. Right. So I guess when somebody says that, I want to know, it's like, okay, is there some like deep theoretical reason you think that has to be true? Or are you just sort of saying, hey, man, I'm just looking at the historical record and this seems to be the case? Because if it's the first one, I want to know what it is, right? And then if it's the second one, I would say let's zoom in on the details of the historical record, because people who say this never really do that. It's always just a very quick inference without like a lot of discussion about the historical specifics. Because it seems to me that when you look at the historical record, there are about a zillion examples of capitalist countries that start out more democratic and become more authoritarian. In fact, oftentimes they become more authoritarian with the enthusiastic support of like the business owning class, precisely because they think that that's a way of saving capitalism. Like, Pinochet overthrowing the democratic socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile and starting his dictatorship and reign of terror there, right? That's a classic example, but there are lots of examples like that. But it seems to me that there is exactly one example in all of human history that even looks like it's maybe an example of an attempt to create a more democratic form of socialism turning into authoritarianism, and that would be the Russian Revolution. And in that example, I mean, you were kind of mentioning some of these things earlier, right? But I think it's like really worth kind of reviewing, right? Like, let's really think about that example, because what you had was actually not the kind of country that like most socialists historically have thought would be sort of ripe for socialism. That's like an advanced capitalist country. It was this backwards, semi-feudal country. Most people were peasants. The urban working class is a minority of the population. They've just been devastated by World War I, which was like kind of apocalyptic in Russia in a way that Americans have a hard time imagining. After the revolution, they were invaded by 14 different countries to try to stop it, which was also like really long-running, bloody thing. Like most of the workers who were originally participating in the revolution died in the Civil War. And those are the circumstances that like this really very authoritarian system emerged in the Soviet Union. And that's the one and only example historically. When people say things like, well, every attempt at socialism becomes authoritarian, I don't think they're being serious, because you ask them which countries they have in mind, and they start listing off a bunch of countries where there was never any attempt to create a more democratic form of socialism. I mean, Mao's China didn't become authoritarian, right? Enver Hoxha's Albania didn't become authoritarian. These are places that started out authoritarian. These are regimes where the people who were taking power in the first place were capital C communists who were self-consciously trying to replicate the Soviet model because that was just their vision of what socialism was. And people who want to say there's a second example of something that started out as an attempt to create a more democratic form of socialism becoming authoritarian will usually, in my experience, point to Venezuela, right? They'll say, "Oh, that's the other one." Like after you make some of the kinds of points that I just made. But honestly, I mean, the risk sounded harsh. That one really feels kind of dishonest to me, because even if all you mean by socialism is state ownership, right? Like, even if that's all you mean, the public sector is actually a much smaller part of the economy in Venezuela than it is in places like Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland. So if you're going to blame the sort of, and like, look, there's a complicated argument to have about like what's going on in Venezuela. I think on, one side, people who are like defenders of that government would point to all the sanctions and economic warfare for the US, and critics would point to, all the corruption and currency mismanagement and other things. But whatever you think about that, right? And, maybe some combination of the two, right? Like whatever you think about that, given that the public sector is so much bigger in all those really successful Nordic countries than it is in Venezuela, if you're going to blame, Venezuela's problems, the sort of authoritarian things about it, the economic problems, if you're going to blame those on socialism, I mean, if you're not a hack, you have to be equally willing to credit the democracy and good economy in those other countries to socialism. I mean, I just don't understand how you can have it both ways.
Yeah, that makes me think that. Do you think that the word socialism has been used in the names of some of these regimes as more of a propaganda?
Sure, yeah, of course. I mean, look, basically all important political words are like that, right? I mean, democracy has been used by a bunch of countries that were not at all democratic.
That's one thing.
I mean, look, I, you know, I'm an atheist. You are host to something called Atheist Edge, so I'd assume you are too. But like, I don't have, but like, I'll give Christianity enough credit to say that it's like not everything bad that's ever been done in the name of Christianity actually reflects the sort of like core of what Christianity preaches, right? I mean, I think that would be kind of a silly thing to say, right? Like, just given that like for a long time, everything that everybody did in Europe was justified by Christianity, because that was just kind of the ideology that everybody was using, right? So it's like, I don't think the fact that like whatever kind of term is popular with a given population at a given time, I mean, of course, people are gonna sort of wrap themselves in the flag of that at any given time. I mean, that by itself doesn't really tell you much, right? I think that if a concept has never been used to justify anybody doing anything bad, it's probably just not a very popular concept.
Right. And if we look at the current state of affairs, it seems that capitalism is also leading to authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there are a lot of examples of that, historically. I mean, like if you sort of look at the history of capitalism, there are a lot of politically non-democratic countries that that have had basically capitalist economies. Oftentimes, oftentimes countries have become authoritarian precisely because sort of right-wing authoritarian regimes were worried that the alternative was that they'll become socialist, and they'll say that, right? Like whether propagandistically or really meaning it, right? Like they'll say that quite openly, right? Like this is why we had to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, they will. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next one. I think we kind of touched on this a little bit. Socialism ignores human nature.
Yeah, I mean, this one's really interesting to me because I think my take on this is a little bit different from a lot of people's, because a lot of people think that the more you assume that human nature is nice and benevolent and cooperative, the more you should think we can have like a nice, benevolent, cooperative system like socialism. And the more you think human nature is selfish and greedy and cruel, the more you think we're just stuck with capitalism forever. Certainly a lot of anti-socialists think that. And a lot of socialists think that the only way to resist this argument is to insist that human nature is actually nice and benevolent after all. And look, I mean, I think as far as the empirical question goes, is human nature kind and cooperative? Is it cruel and greedy? I mean, I think the only honest answer is that's a really messy combination of all of those elements. David Hume once wrote that the problem, like with the idea that a just God would send some people to heaven and everybody else to hell, is that most of us, Hume said, float between vice and virtue, right? And not really good enough to deserve eternal infinite reward, and not really bad enough to deserve eternal infinite punishment. And, that feels right to me. But whatever. Put aside the whole issue of how good or bad human nature is. My problem with the way this argument is usually set up is just on a conceptual level. I fundamentally think everybody in this debate just kind of misses the point usually. Because the idea that you should be fine with capitalism if you think human nature is selfish and cruel, and you should only be a socialist if you think human nature is wonderful and benevolent, honestly, to me, in a way, feels backwards. Because the more selfish and cruel you're worried about people being, right? The more you think like one person is going to treat another person that they have enough power over the way that like a little kid treats a spider in a jar, then it seems to me the better reason you have to transition to a more equal economy where people have less power over each other economically. The more you should want us to all sort of, collectively own and democratically run things together, which would equalize that power as much as at all possible, right? I mean, it actually seems like, look, I mean, we were kind of talking about this earlier, and I was saying, I don't want to be too pessimistic about this, and I don't, right? Like, I think obviously it'd be, I would be much happier in the long run, right? If it turned out that those sorts of aspects of our nature, could be minimized over time. But like, look, let's just assume for the sake of argument that they can't be. I actually think that strengthens the case for socialism. I mean, capitalism wouldn't be so bad if we could just trust capitalists not to abuse their power over workers, not to treat people the way Jeff Bezos treats Amazon warehouse workers, we were talking about earlier, I don't know, the way Harvey Weinstein treated aspiring actresses. If I thought everybody was going to be an angel, well, that would mean I wouldn't worry that like some people were going to end up sleeping in the streets, because no matter how economically unequal society got, I'd trust that people who had more would always benevolently share what they had with people who had less. And, it's okay, brother, you can sleep in the spare bedroom to make sure that doesn't happen, right? It's because I don't think that people are angels. I think we need to have, more equal distribution of resources and economic power to make it harder for people to be in a position to abuse each other.
It seems as if we can notice that in mass on a political scale when it comes to creating something like America, the United States of America versus the United Kingdom, when we had an authoritarian king and he could, redistribute wealth as he pleased as a king. But we had an idea of let's have more power for the people there. But we seem to have lost the plot there when it comes to economy.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think this actually kind of gets back to some of what we were talking about earlier, that I think that, part of why that anti-oligarchy rhetoric, I think, is hitting a chord with a lot of people right now is because, what a lot of people, certainly including me, are very worried about the political system becoming more authoritarian and kind of losing some of those, constitutional protections that we always thought we had. That I think it's kind of natural to be like, oh yeah, right. Sort of, so like the same reason that we don't want to have like a king or a dictator or anything like that shouldn't stop operating in the economy. That like it's not the same way that that we don't want to have like one person or a few people have that kind of power over us there. Then we shouldn't want that during the like half of the 8 out of every 16 waking hours that most adults most days of the week spend at work, and also that the two problems are connected, right? I mean that this is that like we the president is a billionaire, Elon Musk is a much richer billionaire, and these are the people who are like doing a lot of this stuff, and it does. I think it is a pretty natural thought to connect those dots.
Yeah, absolutely. So, speaking of Elon Musk and his Doge boys, what do you say to somebody who might say that socialized programs are inefficient and wasteful?
Well, I'd make 2 points about that one. First, I just say this is an empirical question. We can check. And I really don't think the real world numbers line up with libertarian dogma here. So, for example, even in the United States, right, not a place that's overflowing with socialized programs, we can compare like public health insurers like Medicare and Medicaid to the private insurers, and the public ones actually have way less bureaucratic overhead than the for-profit private insurers that end up kind of constantly searching for excuses to deny coverage and fight with patients about it. And we can look around the world, see countries with totally public healthcare systems that the same thing is true, and they deliver better results than ours by like every metric. Even, I mean, in my experience, even like really right-wing people who hate the idea of like Medicare for all, that example, don't really like work up too much of sweat defending the system we have now, right? Like I did a debate a few years ago with Charlie Kirk, and even Charlie Kirk was like, yeah, okay, the American healthcare system has a lot of problems. It's not great, right? So I would, and I'm not saying I think every example is going to be like healthcare. I do think the total picture is going to be more complicated than that, but I think it's the kind of example that should really make us question the assumption that publicly owned programs are always more inefficient and wasteful. So that's one point. The other point is, okay, in those cases where it really is true that some socialized programs involve a lot of bureaucratic waste, what I want to do is I want to zoom in on the details and ask why that happens in the cases where it does happen. I think that we want to, if we're serious about this, I mean, we should just sort of not just kind of notice that like bureaucratic waste exists in this thing, but we should like think a little bit harder about how that happens. And what I'd like to suggest is that not all public programs are created equal. I mean, the kind of public programs, the kind of government services that, leftists, like people who are like to the left of sort of regular American Democratic Party liberalism, right? Socialists, social democrats, what people like that typically advocate are universal programs like Medicare for all, as opposed to means tested programs like Medicaid that like only some people get to use. And the means testing, right? Well, what is that? I mean, that's sorted out by bureaucrats to see who's poor and desperate enough to deserve help. And that's really where the bureaucracy comes in. That's really where you're empowering bureaucrats, because if everyone has healthcare, just sticking with that example, if it's just kind of a basic right that everybody gets for being part of our society, then you've just disempowered all the bureaucrats. Because sure, look, I mean, you still need some bureaucrats. Any system, public or private, is going to have some people who work in offices and push around paper who are bureaucrats in that sense. But bureaucrats only have power when they get to gatekeep who gets the benefit and who doesn't. And making programs universal actually takes that away.
Yeah, I like that idea. And also, I'd like to comment that when we visualize how these things can play out as far as bureaucracies and systems, it doesn't have to be anything like what we're used to. We have the ability to reimagine any aspect of these programs and policies that we have. We just have to have a little bit of imagination. And I really would encourage people that are so against, more radical ideas or not so mainstream to really just try to use some imagination. And maybe you could be the one to devise the proper way to enact these policies.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that it's, I think in some ways that's a symptom of people not feeling like they have a lot of democratic input into the way that their society is run, that they're just sort of like, they're just thinking about it. It's like, okay, here's this menu of options that like, here's the way it looks when we let corporations run things. And, here are the like few examples in my life of things that are publicly run. And, we're just sort of being given these packages. It's like, well, no, I mean, if you actually are trying to engage in more radical social change, then you get to, it's not just like a take it or leave it package, right? You can argue about the details and how it should work and, craft something that might be better.
Absolutely. Okay. So how would you respond to someone that might say that socialism leads to higher taxes and economic stagnation? This is kind of on the same vein as the idea of less innovation or incentives.
Right. Yeah. So again, this one seems to be, I think when people say this, presumably what they're really thinking of when they talk about socialism is not so much the sort of more ambitiously radical kind of end state idea, democracy at work, but just kind of, democratic socialist policies, stuff they have lots of in the Nordic countries, stuff that, Bernie Sanders advocates, the kind of thing I, as a socialist, think are good steps in the right direction, but not quite all the way there. At least I assume that's what people mean, because I've never heard anybody say that like the problem with the Soviet Union was that the taxes were too high, right? Presumably at that point, you're sort of at a different scale of problems. But I guess to answer the question a little more concretely, it's probably worth separating out the two halves, right? The higher taxes half and the stagnation half. So on the higher taxes, look, in some ways that might be true. So, I mean, I know people who are big believers in MMT, modern monetary theory, would say that actually when countries that have sovereign currency spend money, it's really not based on taxation the way we normally think it is. And that's like it's an idea that's interesting enough and out there enough that it's worth mentioning, but I'm not going to assume that, right? Like I think that'd be making it way too easy on myself. So I'm just going to like assume that those people are wrong, right? Like assuming we really do need to fund all this stuff with taxation. Even making that assumption, I'm still not really that moved by the taxes thing. I think if you ask the average Swede or Finn, for example, how would you feel if we privatized the healthcare system and started charging tuition at your kid's college and got rid of all the financial support, that we give to like parents, while they're bringing up kids and all of that stuff. But hey, grand bargain. On the other end, we'll lower your taxes. I don't think most people go for that, right? I think there's a reason why even most conservative parties in those countries don't like go as far as to like, advocate any of that, right? Because part of the reason is I think most people are ultimately going to care more about their overall quality of life. They're going to care about how much money is in their pocket at the end of the process, what they can buy with it, and what they don't need to buy with it, right? Because it's provided in some other way, as opposed to just like the tax rate per se being like the only thing they care about. So like, here's a nice concrete example. In 2020, when Bernie Sanders ran for president, he had his Medicare for All proposal. Even the libertarians, the Mercatus Center, they put out this kind of hit, report on it to try to show it'd be way too expensive. But even when you look at the numbers in that report, you see that even according to those numbers, most middle-income taxpayers who currently have private insurance would actually save money if you abolished private health insurance and just put.
I do remember seeing that.
Yeah, single public plan, because even if the taxes you use to pay for it, like even if like let's assume again, no MMT stuff. Let's assume that it's all paid for by taxes. Let's even assume the taxes you're using to pay for aren't all that progressive, right? We're not really making the upper income strata, like pull most of the weight. Even so, when we compare health insurance premiums and copays and deductibles and all the rest of the ways those companies rob us to people paying a slightly higher tax rate to fund, single public plan, even in that Mercatus calculation, most middle-class people would still end up, overall with more money in their pockets. And I guess I'd make one other point about the tax half, which is, look, Americans tend to sort of hate and resent taxes, and I'm including myself in that, right? I absolutely hate doing taxes. I usually like apply for an extension because I have because like I'm getting frantic trying to figure it out at the last minute. I get it, right? But I think that we tend to hate taxes in this country for two reasons. One, we often don't feel like we're getting much back on the other end in terms of services, right? That it feels like a bad deal. And two, what's that?
Short-sightedness.
Yeah, sure. Right. I mean, some of it's short-sightedness. Some of it's people don't like, it's like there's stuff. Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's some stuff that's like not obvious, but you'll miss it when it's gone, right? That's all true, right? But like, but also like, look, we're really not getting as much of that back on the other end as people in lots of other countries are. And then two, I think the word taxes triggers this kind of Pavlovian response because the way we set it up in this country makes the process so annoying. But in a lot of these Nordic countries, if you just have a regular job, right? You actually don't have to prepare your own taxes. I mean, like you'll actually get like the like revenue service. Like I think in Finland, they'll like literally send you like a text message with a summary, and you can just kind of text back yes, and that's the entire process. And I had a friend in the UK who told me that yeah, right. That like there, it's like a lot of people don't even know when tax season is because it's so automated, right? That they don't even do the text message there, right? So, and the reason we don't have any of that in the U.S. Well, one, I think
H&R
conservatives,
Block,
are yeah, I mean, H&R Block is the big reason, right? I mean, they've consistently
lobbyists.
looked against doing stuff like that. Right? So, and then I guess on the economic stagnation part of the question, I guess I would just say that I think the proof is in the pudding, right? You know, some of the places in the world that we keep talking about that have like gone the furthest in the direction actually seem to be doing pretty well. Like, I think, average income in some of the countries I mentioned, per year is a little bit less in the US, but that's mostly because people work a lot less. I think if you actually look at income per hour worked, right, they're beating us by most metrics. And if you think, okay, the Nordics are like the absolute limit of like any progress we can make in that direction, again, I just say like you kind of owe me a reason to think that that's the best we can do, right? That like that's like the outermost limit of like what could happen in the future. I think I think we should keep pushing, right? I mean, I want to run the experiment. Like, I don't want to just live in a really unequal, undemocratic economy forever because we're afraid of some unproven speculation about how bad we think anything else would possibly be, right? I mean, I think I think if you're not willing to continue to try things, I mean, this sort of sounds very simple-minded saying it, but it's like, yeah, if you're not willing to keep on trying things, you're just stuck where you are, right? Like, you're like, I think you should keep trying to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big time Trekkie all my life, so that is my paradigm for what we can achieve. I am always trying to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This is the big one, I think. Maybe not the big one, but this is certainly one that I think is big on the list here. That people say that socialism, that wealth redistribution, is unfair and punishes success.
Yeah, I mean, this one's interesting to me because I think there are two different objections to redistribution that people often kind of have in mind when they say this. So if you want to say redistribution is unfair, like just in itself, I think a lot of times what people have in mind is that um, it's like unfair because it's like stealing. So like libertarians will talk about the non-aggression principle, which basically says no one has a right to interfere with my person or my property if I didn't start it, right? Basically, and I think the problem with that, if you think about it a little bit, is that at least the part of that about property um, is ultimately going to be just kind of circular. It's empty. And here's what I mean when I say it's empty. When you say, okay, you can't interfere with my property, what does my mean in that sentence? Because it can't mean what's legally mine. Because if that's what you meant, then if the government is redistributing wealth by passing laws, then it wouldn't violate the principle after all, right? Because it's not legally yours. Future socialist government passes the nationalizing Amazon and turning it into a worker co-op act of 2050, then at that point, legally, it's not the property of Jeff Bezos anymore. But mine also can't just mean whatever property happens to be in my possession at a given time, because if it meant that, then the non-aggression principle would forbid recovery of stolen property. So what it has to mean is that you can't take away property that I'm morally entitled to keep. And maybe you think I'm morally entitled to keep certain property because you have some view like John Locke's theory of property rights that you mix your labor with unowned things and therefore you get a right to it. This is a little unkind, but I have to say, like, that always reminds me of like when like little boys will like fight over some possession and one of them's like, oh, I spit on it, it's mine now, right? It's like that's kind of the that's kind of the sense I always get when I'm reading the Locke stuff. But regardless, I think if that's what you mean, then the principle is just circular, right? Because if what you're saying is it's morally wrong to take away whatever property I'm morally entitled to keep, right? I mean, that's just a way of saying it's wrong to take stuff that it's wrong to take. Nobody disagrees, right? 100% of the disagreement is always about which stuff, people are morally entitled to, which is just a
Right.
different way of asking what kind of distribution of resources is morally justified. And you can have very different theories of that. There's that lock-in kind of theory, or there's something more like what you get from John Rawls, 20th century philosopher, basically says, well, just distribution is whatever you'd sign on to if you didn't know whether you were going to get the long or the short end of the stick. I find the egalitarian theories of that a lot more plausible, certainly, but like one way or the other, I think that's what the real argument is about. Not like, I think all the, it's bad because it's theft stuff is just arguing in a circle. That doesn't really, there's no real substance there. But maybe to me, the more interesting part of the question isn't even about, redistribution being wrong in itself in that non-aggression kind of way, but it's the part about redistribution, I think you said, like punishing success. And there's a suggestion here, right? Like, say, okay, what's the conception of what counts as a just distribution that's like underlying that sentiment, right? That's like, it's bad to punish success. And it sounds to me like what people are suggesting when they talk like this is a kind of meritocratic conception that people should get rewarded in proportion to how hardworking they are, how what they contribute. And the thing about that is that we all know that under capitalism, there are inevitably going to be lots of inequalities that have absolutely nothing to do with who's, worked harder or contributed more. I mean, inherited wealth, for example, is by definition wealth that you didn't work for. Same with wealth that comes from like passive income, like rent or stock ownership. So if your principle is that the distribution of wealth should just reflect how hard everybody works, what they contribute, then seems to me that if we wanted to get that, like what you're advocating is actually this massive equalization of wealth, so that the only inequalities that are left are ones that like reflect actual like effort, which would require, no more inherited wealth, no more passive income, all that. Kind of sounds like you need a fully socialist system in order to actually actualize that principle. But maybe last point about this one, what really fascinates me about this phrase, and I know what you're talking about, people talk this way all the time, but like, is the punishing language, like punishing success. Like if we move toward a more equal distribution, that would punish people who are currently rich. Because that suggests to me that if someone gets less, if we move towards an economic setup where somebody has less than they would have otherwise, right? That means
it reminds me of when businesses say that they lost money because they didn't capitalize on a specific thing.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I mean, like, look, if we're going to say, if economic system A punishes people who would have more in economic system B, which again, if we're going to say that like moving toward a more equal system would punish people who are rich right now, that seems to be what we're suggesting, is something like that principle. And I guess my question would be, okay, well, wait a second. What about all the poor and working class people right now, right? The majority of the population under capitalism. I mean, are they being punished for something by being given like a smaller slice of the pie in this system? And, if not, like, why are we using the punishing language in the other direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, obviously you're not a libertarian, so I wouldn't ask you this question, but I'm just wondering if maybe somebody watches this in the future, a libertarian, can answer this question. How do they square the non-aggression principle with the reality of the aggression that was historical in pretty much all the procurement and deeding of any lands and properties that we have on the books today?
I mean, look,
perplexing to me.
As somebody who's debated a lot of libertarians, I think there's a range of answers to that. I think that like some of them will be like, okay, well, like Robert Nozick, for example, in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, says, okay, you can do like a little bit of redistribution, but only to make up for past aggression, right? And some of them,
That's a start.
something, right? Some of them will just sort of say, like, we'll like really want to like fight about like, there hasn't been that much that, it's like they'll really want to deny the premise that like the distribution that we have right now reflects that much of that, which seems like especially crazy to me, honestly, in America, because like, look, I mean, Europe, it's bad enough. I mean, before you had capitalism, you had feudalism, and if you look at the transition from feudalism to capitalism, you had all of these peasants who were like violently driven off their land and the enclosures and all of that, right? So that's already a lot of aggression in the background of the distribution of wealth, but like that's a utopia of like sort of cozy consensual transition compared to what happened, in this country. Because I mean, if you kind of pan out over the last several hundred years, I mean, you had the previous inhabitants of this place, like very violently dispossessed from that ownership. You had a lot of the 18th and 19th century economy being built up by slavery, in the South. So it seems to me that like even if you do believe that this sort of theory that's like, okay, as long as you're sort of starting out with like lock-in homesteading, people are mixing their labor with natural world, and then they're doing consensual free market trades and all of that, then whatever results from that would therefore be fine, right? Whatever results from that, no matter how unequal it is, it's fine, and it would be wrong to redistribute any of it. Now, look, obviously, I don't believe that. That's very, very different from my worldview. I mean, I'm an egalitarian, but even if you did believe that, it just seems to me that that's just not going to take you very far as defending the distribution of wealth in the real world, because the economic history of the real world is nothing like that.
Yeah, it's pretty grim, actually.
Yeah.
I actually had a conversation with GPT a while ago, because there's always these references to socialist and communist countries and their death tolls in the propaganda. And I'm just wondering if anybody's ever done a calculation of all the deaths related to capitalism. And I don't have that result with me. Unfortunately, maybe I should make a video out of that whole conversation. But I do believe that if we did a real study, a rigorous one on that one, we might find some surprising results.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly think so. I mean, just people dying of easily treatable diseases. I mean, there's even like I mean, I know there are even like studies on how even things as simple as like raising the minimum wage can impact life expectancy. So I mean, I think that if I think sort of like any honest estimate of that, I think the death toll from having a society that's unequal, is going to be, is going to be pretty astronomical. And look, I don't want to like rest too much on like, oh, see, well, this is also really bad, or maybe even worse, so it's not a big deal that all those people died in Stalin's Russia and etc. Right? It's like, look, I mean, what they had in that, I mean, like you, my first choice would be the sort of Star Trek vision of high tech, universally shared like abundance, right? If we can have that kind of socialism, that would be my first choice. If we can't have that, I'd at least like some, sort of like market socialist setup where we have a lot of things be publicly run, and whatever's left is, worker co-ops. But I think that just because you have one non-capitalist thing that was really bad, I don't think you should just say, okay, well, there we go, lesson learned. If we mess with the golden goose, it's just going to turn out terribly. So we just have to have this thing forever and ever until the end of time.
There was that movie, The Big Short. There was a quote in there that said like, every 1% the unemployment goes up, 40,000 people die. Assuming that's true, I'm not sure, but if anything like that is true,
I think it's plausible, though, right? I mean, like, because people do. There are a lot. I mean, look, it's not. There are a lot of ways that unemployment, that unemployment does lead to that. I mean, like, I don't think I don't think that the opioid epidemic sort of coinciding with deindustrialization and really hitting the Rust Belt the way that it does, was a coincidence, right? I mean, just to kind of pick that, that obvious example. I think if you look at kind of the increase in deaths of despair, right, in those parts of the country, from drug abuse, suicide, et cetera, right? Like I think there are a lot of ways that one can lead to another. I mean, or even just things as as sort of less obvious than that, is just like people who are more stressed out are more likely to smoke. People who have less money are unlikely to, are less likely to prepare healthy meals, like all of that stuff. I think there are lots of ways that, that economic misery can increase the death rate, even if we're starting with the kind of starting point of like a, 21st century Western society where we have some social safety net, even in the US, et cetera. I mean, never mind, kind of capitalism in its raw form in that 19th century kind of sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I do have one more on the list here. Then
Sure.
I know you probably want to get out of here real soon, so we'll wrap it up after that.
Sure.
And it's not really a big one. It's just they might say that capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than socialism ever has. What would you say to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I don't want to be too much of a broken record about this, but I would just say, like, when you're contrasting capitalism to socialism, what kind of socialism do you have in mind? I mean, if what you mean is the 20th century Soviet model, we're kind of back into that argument about how to define coffee and whether arsenic strain through coffee grounds counts. But putting that aside, I would just say two things. One is socialists have always given capitalism credit for creating a lot more material abundance than previous ways of organizing human society did. That part is not in dispute between the two sides. The step from feudalism to capitalism was a long step in the right direction, certainly in terms of human freedom, but also in terms of building up a really productive economic machine that produces material abundance, even if it distributes it in wildly unequal ways. Socialists have always said that. Karl Marx says this in the opening pages of the Communist Manifesto. But, from a socialist perspective, the exciting possibility is that now that we have that economic machine, for the first time in human history, we have a chance of taking that material abundance, that machine builds up, and combining it with a much more equal way of organizing society. If we can kind of all take over the economic machine and run it in a democratic, egalitarian way, right? So it's like, look, so capitalism is better than what came before. Sure. Like almost nobody really denies that. I mean, you can find somebody who denies everything, but like, by and large, right, like that part's not really in dispute. The question is whether that's the best we can do forever, right? Whether, or whether the human race can take another step and have something better than that. And to some extent, this is speculative, but, just to kind of go back to one of the sort of core themes I've been trying to hammer this whole time, because like, I know that if you're listening to what I'm saying and, not you, but I mean, somebody in the audience, right? Like if, somebody's listening to what I'm saying and they're kind of skeptical about a lot of where I'm coming from, to the extent that I'm just saying, oh, hey, here's this speculative thing that's never existed, but trust me, it'll be great. I can understand why somebody could be skeptical about that, right? It's like, oh, yeah, no, I'm not buying it, right? But, which is why I keep wanting to go back to the real world point that, sure, we don't have anywhere in the world that's all the way to what I want, but we can compare places that have taken more or fewer steps in that direction. And the places that, even if they're still sort of capitalist in the basics of the economy, have gone the furthest that way, that have, implemented the most democratic socialist policies, are manifestly way better places to live than the capitalist countries that have taken fewer steps in that direction. So, the question to my mind is just, look, is that where progress ends, or should we keep experimenting with something that goes even further? And I want to do that, right? Like, I mean, and by the way, also kind of a side note to this, but if you look at where the most people have been lifted out of poverty in the last several decades, it's in China. And of course, people can say, oh, see, but that happened after they did all these market reforms, and true enough. But also, like, I don't know, I want to know what the standard is for like how to measure socialism that makes like Venezuela more socialist than China, right? Like that, as far as like the role that the state plays in the economy and all that. I mean, China is in a million ways not the model I'd advocate at all, right? But like it's also pretty far from a free market vision of how a society would would be run, right? Like and so again, to me, like if our only choices are countries that basically look like America or countries that basically look like China, I mean, like to me, that's a pretty depressing set of options, right? Like, but I think that we can kind of we can maybe say, look, I mean, we can look at different models and say, all right, what are the parts of these we like? What are the parts that we don't like? Are there ways we can combine these? And we say, in like in a country like China, there is this bigger role for state economic planning, and in fact, it's that seems to have allowed it to sort of turbocharge that growth. It's still a very unequal distribution and still very politically authoritarian, but are there things we can learn about what works well that we can combine with other things and have something that might be better than either one of these, right? Again, like should we keep pushing? Should we keep trying to experiment with better ways of organizing society? And I want to do that, right? I mean, the same way that I would say, like if you think back to the 19th century, you can look at like abolitionists, are pushing to get rid of slavery, suffragettes who are pushing to, extend political rights to women. Like these were the kinds of movements that were advocating kinds of social change that seemed absolutely crazy to a lot of people in those societies at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think right now we're all kind of grateful that those people did that, right? Like that's like, yeah, it seemed like an absolutely crazy departure from the way that things had always been, but really good that those things happened. And I think, right, that if we're ever lucky enough to make it to like really fully democratic socialist future, I think we'll be happy we didn't stop here either.
Yeah, I hope we don't stop here, Lord. So yeah, that's all the ones I have for you today, Dr. Burgis. I really do appreciate you being here and answering these questions for me. I really want to try to present something to people that they can digest and try to consider how socialism might actually play out, and just give them some answers to some of the questions they might have. Because I really do think that at this point in time, it's become pretty obvious that allowing the rich to control us is just not an option. And I think that most people can see that, hopefully. Yeah. But would you have any final thoughts before we close out?
No, thanks for having me.
All right, I appreciate it, Dr. Burgis. Thank you again. And remember, he is linked in the description below on Substack and his YouTube channel. So please check that out if you have a chance. And I really do appreciate you all for being here. And I just want to say, it's the bridges we build, not the bridges we burn, that give us the edge. Y'all have a great night.